Hello and welcome to Voice of Crypto.
Everyone will be jumping on the bandwagon of trying to be eco-conscious.
The new blockchain is a solution which is verifiable, brings transparency.
Hello and welcome to Voice of Crypto, a podcast where we talk about Web3, crypto, metaverse, NFT, everything. And today we have two special guests, Deshith and Hassan with us, who are creating something very interesting which a lot of people are talking about, and there's a real need of blockchain in this category. So welcome on the podcast, Deshith and Hassan.
Thank you, Abhishek. Great to be here.
Thank you, Abhishek.
So Deshith and Hassan, the first question which I ask everyone is how you guys got into Web3. Do you remember that incident, that accident? Because I'm sure when you were a kid, nobody planned to be in Web3 because there was no Web3. So do you remember that particular accident, and what was your previous life before getting into Web3? Deshith, will start with you.
Yeah, no, sure. I guess that's a very interesting question. I guess my encounter was basically traditional finance in the very beginning. And then I sort of drifted on to fintech, DeFi, and business analytics in that sense. And then even in London, I've previously worked at a decentralized exchange, and then starting to understand the sort of DeFi landscape and the corporate compliance that comes with it. I think it was very intriguing to just fall into the lap of Web3 and decentralized finance, I guess. Just in general, having worked in London prior to starting this project and becoming a co-founder, I guess when you're involved in finance, you just tend to be looking at the next step ahead, and I think DeFi and Web3 is the way forward. So yeah.
Hassan, what about you? You are your story.
Yeah, so I'm actually a finance guy, a traditional finance guy, and then I moved into ESG, so that's actually my background. And we connected together through a mutual friend and shared ideas. We thought, well, we can definitely bring our skill set together, and here we are. So I don't have much depth in Web3, etc. That's where Deshith and our other colleague comes into play. But on the ESG side, that's something I've been in for about 9 years now.
Wow.
So that's what I'm trying to add to the value add to the project.
Great, amazing, and I think that's a real use case of blockchain technology which you guys are trying to build. And I'm saying it's a real use case because this is something which will really impact somebody's lives. It's not selling and buying your NFTs or your JPEGs. So tell us about Greenlabs. What is Greenlabs? What is the vision behind it? What you guys are trying to build here?
Yeah, I think when we, at the forefront of it, when we even came together, I think we shared a vision of trying to marry the concepts of ESG, sustainability, and crypto together, purely because of the sort of financial outreach that you could have and inclusion on top of it. So where blockchain technology helps, not just merely in terms of just the outreach and the inclusion, but in terms of the inherent issues that we face with traditional carbon credits, for example. So I think one of the pain points that we figured was that there was not really carbon out there in the market as a tradable asset or as a tokenized asset to begin with. And there was quite an exploitative voluntary carbon market that's out there with varying levels of price discrimination volatility, and also varying levels of frameworks and standardizations of how they essentially understand and compute for carbon accountability. And that is, I guess, where we essentially dived straight into this concept of carbon credits on the blockchain. And I think the benefits that you get from blockchain in terms of immutability, transparency, interoperability, all these help the consumer, and also in meeting certain protocols of measurement, reporting, and verification when it comes to carbon credits. So, I mean, even if you were to look at the markets in general, and there's essentially two dominant markets when it comes to carbon, and that will be essentially the mandatory markets with its emissions trading schemes, which is essentially a cap and trade system, And then you've also got your voluntary carbon market, where a lot of the players are now trying to dive in and sort of take accountability for their carbon footprint. But what we've also seen with these voluntary carbon market credits is the fact that there's varying levels of volatility when it comes to the price, purely because of the varying levels of standardization. So you could see one particular voluntary carbon market credit going for cents on the dollar, and then you have like really high quality credits that are hovering around $70 per credit. So what we want to essentially establish at some point is a certain level of price regulation and also harmonized standards across the sphere. So that is essentially what we work towards with Greenlabs and our Green Coin token.
So Hassan, one question for you. You mentioned about ESG, and a lot of people don't know what is ESG. So if you could elaborate on what is ESG, why is it important, and why corporates are moving towards ESG compliances as well.
Well, I think it's a broad term, so it's environmental, social, and governance. So in each of the three aspects, I mean, there's a lot of depth. So if you just speak about environmental angle, I mean, you have the basics, which is carbon emission and energy usage, but then you can go into water, you can go into the biodiversity side of things, etc. On the social side, that brings into it play, for example, from a corporate side, how your employees work, interact, what's the quality of living, etc. Governance again brings in more. It can allude to corporate governance. So I mean, how your board is structured, etc. But also how the company's governance is helping the environment. I think primarily environmental aspect is quite important. I think that's a discussion that's going around the world now. I remember back in 2014-15, I would talk to corporates and investors, and it wasn't something that big on their agenda. But now everybody wants to talk about it. And then, for example, the COP, we're going to COP 28 right now. That's a big theme. It's getting coverage on all national and international media as well. And I think it's all got to do with climate change. So there is science behind it. You could be on either side of the fence. You could believe in climate change or not. But there is evidence of changing weather patterns, extreme weather scenarios, and that is connected to man-made carbon emission. But what's interesting is I've come across some individuals, professors in universities who actually were looking at climate change back in the 70s. And they were consulting with insurance companies, and insurance companies even back then were considering climate change as part of the underwriting process. So it's just that it's been there, it's just become much more in the limelight now. And I think we see the effects of it as well. So it's quite an important topic. I think what's also one needs to keep in mind is there's also a lot of greenwashing going on. So corporates, individuals, they tend to kind of project the fact that they're environmentally conscious, but if you dig deep into the detail, then it turns out it's more a marketing gimmick. So it's important to keep the differentiation, and I think it affects everyone. It affects me, it affects you, it affects Deshith, it affects the people listening to the podcast. So I think it's something that will define our times for sure.
Amazing. And you guys are trying to combine carbon capture, emission traceability, blockchain. So you're trying to mix all these things. Can you help us in understanding how these multiple elements work together, and then what unique advantages you guys are offering in terms of integration with Greenlabs?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so if you're to just very basically, just for everyone to sort of understand what a carbon credit essentially is to basically look at the traditional sort of carbon sequestration projects and how they essentially try to utilize a certain square footage, hectares of land in terms of capturing carbon. Now, what essentially happens with these traditional schemes is that there's going to be a ton of leakage, a ton of impermanence in terms of the projects, and the level of monitoring that goes into that would be subpar. And this inherently translates rather into just low quality credits that are sold on the market. And then obviously with the concept that Hassan brought up in terms of greenwashing, is that people are able to essentially overstate the amount of carbon credits you buy on a market at a cheaper price for a low quality credit.
Mm.
So what happens with the intervention of blockchain here is essentially with the sort of smart contract that you're able to provide in terms of the metadata inherent to that particular carbon captured, you're able to track and trace each and every information and have a proper trail back from the vintage of the credit to the origination of the credit and then to its final destination. So there's a lot of transparency that a lot of industry players do value and account for, and that's where the credibility aspect of the carbon credit is established.
Understood. Hassan, my next question is for you in terms of you're an ESG expert. Which are these geographical regions which you think have more impact, or which will have, or probably you guys are focusing, or the whole industry is focusing on? Any specific areas, any specific countries?
I mean, if you look at the impact point of view for climate change, I mean, there's different models that are out there which we can access. I think we're probably sitting in the most safest zone. So I think if you look at it from a climate change angle, potential sea level rise or extreme weather scenarios, I mean, Western and Northern Europe is meant to be very secure, but then the rest of the world is not so much. I mean, the Asia, South Asia, etc. That is, at least from a model scenario, is quite at risk. But then that's the thing, right? I mean, climate change doesn't follow borders, doesn't follow politics, right? It follows the geography, and that's how it works. And I think that also connects to the concept we're trying to do is we're looking at additionality, because we feel it needs the whole challenge needs to be looked at from a global point of view. But the fact is that carbon has gone in the atmosphere. So you feel okay with it. It's you feel satisfied. Well, I paid €5, right? Maybe that €5 goes towards a plantation somewhere. But the carbon's in the atmosphere. You might be flying over Rome. You might be flying over Africa. The carbon's there, right? And I think that's where it needs to be approached from a global aspect. It's not a localized problem. It's a globalized problem. And for our project, we are also looking at it from a global angle. So we're not focusing on specific jurisdictions. Of course, we're starting out with tree plantations as a carbon capture mechanism. Of course, certain jurisdictions and certain geographies are more suited to that. Asia, Africa, South America, for example. So we obviously would be looking into that from a project point of view. But I think as a concept, it's a globalized concept.
Yeah, no, I'd like to just add on to Hassan on that point, which he brought up very pivotally, which is additionality. So I think the most common running theme that we see across the carbon markets is that everyone is essentially trying to offset for whatever they're emitting, and then by the end of the year settle their accounts and be sort of content with knowing that they've met the sort of legislation that's been stipulated by the governments for big business, and so they meet their quotas and they met their requirement and they could move on. But that's a very reactive approach in its essence, purely because you see right across the jurisdictions there's something called the nationally distributed contributions, where each sovereignty is essentially stipulated by their governments the quota for certain emissions, and that depends on how big a GDP or an economy is. So, I mean, the biggest polluters in the world, US, China, Europe, European Union, India, we know to look at these countries, and then you have these net zero commitments that they are to meet by 2030. And to meet those particular conditions of not rising levels of 1.5 degrees Celsius, everyone has to halve their emissions by 45%, which is absolutely unrealistic. And so even with a reactive approach of offsetting carbon, that is merely not going to make ends meet. And we feel like a proactive approach of additionality, where actively removing carbon from the atmosphere is something to be encouraged, rather than putting a price tag on the amount of emissions that you're trying to compensate for.
Exactly, and I think that's the point, right? The idea is we need to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere. So globalization has, of course, increased consumption of fossil fuel, there's increase in population. The offset is not helping the part, and the Paris agreements made the target of 1.5 degree alignment. and if you talk to industry experts, we're way off that.
Mm.
We are actually heading with the current policies,
Mm.
both Europe, US, Asia, etc., towards about a 3.5 degree change in temperature
Okay.
by the end of the century,
Mm.
and that is catastrophic,
Mm.
right? So it's like there's a train coming towards you.
Mm.
You can see it.
Mm.
The sign says it's a train, but you're still sitting there like, oh, maybe I'm not
It's
too
not
sure.
still.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's a global challenge,
Mm.
and I think everybody needs to do their bit. But let's be fair. There's the economic angle that's getting played there. I mean, at COP28, that's what I was reading today as well.
Mm.
The oil lobby is very strong. The
Mm.
fossil fuel lobby is very strong, and they will push against anything that decreases fossil fuel use.
Mm.
So we are a very small, or we're proposing to be a very small part of a very big problem, a small solution to a big problem.
Correct.
But I think that's the thinking that's needed
Mm.
to avert, as personally I see it, a climate disaster. No, maybe not for us, maybe for the next generation, but yeah.
Absolutely. I have to ask this question to you, Deshith, and there have been a lot of conversations around blockchain taking too much energy,
Mm.
and there has been multiple debates around it. What is your take
Yeah.
on it?
I mean, I think this was one of the main pain points that we had to address,
Mm.
even in our white paper,
Mm.
very definitively, in terms of the energy usage when it comes to whichever blockchain that you're willing to be using.
Mm.
I guess after Ethereum
Mm.
2.0 merge,
Mm.
it has been declared that
Mm.
the energy consumption of blockchain had been reduced by 99.5 or 6%, if I'm not
Mm.
mistaken.
Mm.
So it's so low that there was a study that was done
Mm.
where they stated that the SWIFT technology used for credit and debit card transactions,
Mm.
whether it be MasterCard or Visa,
Mm.
is actually higher
Okay.
on account for blockchain. And then of course, I mean, you could get into like the off-chain transactions that are bundling together, like
Mm.
ZK rollups, for example. So
Mm.
the technology has gone above and beyond to ensure less energy
So we are saying
consumption.
blockchain and crypto is more energy efficient as
Than-
compared to a bank. Oh,
than-
that's a
That's
huge
definitely.
information. Even I never
Yeah.
knew about it. Interesting. So my next question to you is the distribution of green coin involves attracting cornerstone investors, and could you share more criteria of how you're approaching these investors and how important strategically they hold in the whole project success rather than taking everybody. So what are you looking at currently? How do you working on this part?
So funding is absolutely pivotal at this stage for us in terms of extending our runway to building up our underlying infrastructure. As I should also stress on our project in terms of its phases. So we're currently at this finalizing of our onboarding platform in terms of carbon standardization, and the next phase is to move into carbon asset tokenization, and then also realizing an entire carbon credit ecosystem in terms of an exchange. So it's a phased out project, and as funding is pivotal for any other project that's out there in the market, what we truly look is not for just funding but strategic partnerships in terms of establishing people with a shared vision. So obviously we tend to be in discussions even now with industries that are very high tech but looking into sustainable businesses, and I think the whole idea is to ensure that we're a community driven platform that ensures that we become the one stop shop for crypto, ESG, DeFi and the Web3 community in terms of becoming climate actors, fighting for positive climate change.
So Hassan, this question is specifically for you. I mean, you have been into ESG space from almost a decade now. Corporates, I'm sure they've started understanding ESG. Do you think will it be easy for them, or they are still understanding ESG plus blockchain? Because then you are mixing, I would say, algebra plus something else, which is extremely complex. How is your experience from corporate side? Are they able to understand it?
It's a good question. I think some corporates are still trying to understand it. I think they just approach it more like a nice to have, right? So if they mention it on their corporate reports or on their products, I mean, that it will just make them more attractive. I think it's a learning curve. I think some corporates, etc., they understand it and they implement it. And I think what I would like to emphasize is ESG is not just about being eco-conscious, right? It's not just like, well, I want to do good for the world, which is of course commendable, but there's a very strong economic case as well. There's the economic case, right? For example, if we talk about this room we're sitting, right? This is consuming a certain amount of energy. If this was an energy efficient room using the right materials, etc., you would pay less bills. So there's an economic angle to it, right? Same with your car. You drive a car, it does 20 mpg. You buy a more efficient car, it will do 50 mpg. You're saving money. So I think what's important, and I think that's part of the education process that's going on globally, it's not just about being eco-conscious, it's also good economic sense. And I think from what we are looking at, carbon and the carbon capture and of course tokenizing it, it's already there. Carbon is being traded. Carbon has a value, right? So, for example, on the EU ETS side, corporates have a quota system where they trade carbon, and it has a value. Right now, I think recently we saw it average about 80 euros per ton. In California, there are projects which are factoring in a price of $150 to $200 per ton. So there is a price to it, right? So I think that's what we're trying to, of course, bring to the market, of course, bring to the retail side of things. So individuals like yourself, like others, they could invest in it. So I think coming back to your question, it's an ongoing process. Whether they understand blockchain or not, I think there's more acceptance coming through. We see big name institutional investors starting to develop products around it, and that is what is, I think, critical to give more momentum to the whole blockchain setup, because it's the like of Vanguards and Blackstones and BlackRocks and those kind of entities and the banks like Goldman's, etc., who bring a lot of legitimacy to this to the blockchain side, and I think it's a perfect match, right? I mean, blockchain is a solution which is verifiable, brings transparency, etc., brings credibility, and then of course if you apply it to projects which are not just helping the environment, helping us, but also make an economic sense.
Correct.
So, but I would say there's still progress to be made. So.
Absolutely. And my next question to both of you is, so you spoke about strategic partnerships. So what are your targets which you are looking to target, so that your whole position in this technology sector is even gets more credibility? And this is a question which I ask everybody: is if you guys can get a time machine, if you can go 5 or 10 years down the line, where do you see yourself and Greenlabs moving from here, and the whole category, the whole industry moving from here?
Yeah, I guess that's a very good question. I mean, this is our vision, right? This is the dream, and the dream is essentially involving ourselves. As we said at the forefront of this conversation, is that we are like a small solution for a big problem at hand, and with our project in terms of onboarding tree plantation schemes and then tokenizing the carbon that we capture and then offering that to the SME and the retail market. That is just a sort of starting point. But where we could essentially see ourselves being springboarded onto is where we realize a huge carbon ecosystem, where with the right partnerships, because the technology is scalable, especially through blockchain, and there's no doubt in that. And it's a matter of finding that right credibility and the partnerships that we build along the way. Even governmental agencies who we definitely seek advice, consultancy, and also support from going forward. For example, the likes of the United Nations Environmental Program to the United Nations Framework for Climate Change are all active programs that are currently out there who are looking into carbon capture and net zero coalition efforts. So essentially we want to ensure that we marry the corporates and also work with these government entities going forward, and their blessing would definitely scale us to a much larger place in terms of realizing a carbon exchange with our own sort of ratings protocol that we'll be able to essentially established for the future.
Hmm.
And the whole point of essentially running this on the blockchain is also that we are able to maintain our own database in terms of like client footprint analysis.
Hmm.
So all the data that we gather is
Hmm.
going to be invaluable to the future when it comes to the likes of dealing in ESG.
Hmm.
And the future seems quite quite a vast arena to play with, if we look at it that way. So
Okay.
that's the dream.
So you mentioned about carbon exchange, Deshith.
Yeah.
Please, I mean, I really like this whole concept. So
Yeah.
what is it? What is the vision? How do you
So
envision it?
essentially what that would be is where we become an automated market maker in essence,
Mhm.
right? Where we are able to onboard carbon assets,
Hmm.
which actually will be verified
Hmm.
that it fits the right criteria on our onboarding platform,
Hmm.
and then we're able to onboard that into our exchange,
Hmm.
and then essentially function as a FX,
Oh,
and we will be the ones handling the carbon trading.
interesting. Interesting.
I think I just would like to pick up on one point that they should mention. I think what's also essential for the blockchain industry, Web3, in my personal view, is regulation.
Hmm.
Call me old-fashioned,
Yeah.
and then I know that was the whole idea of blockchain, right? Of
Hmm.
wanting to get kind of step away from the traditional finance side of things.
Hmm.
But I feel if you want mass adoption on something, you need
Hmm.
credibility.
Correct.
And I think that's where regulation may help.
Hmm.
And what I see in at least the European Union, they've already come up with regulatory frameworks. MICA, for example, is one. So I think that provides more comfort to both the retail consumers, but also large corporates, etc.
Hmm.
And I think that will help further give confidence in the industry.
Hmm.
ESG is already under the whole regulatory side of things. I mean,
Mm.
again, UK, US, Canada, Europe, I mean, they're very strongly focused on ESG regulation.
Hmm.
I think that's helping drive a lot of investment into the sector as well.
Hmm.
So I think that would be something that probably will play out in the next few years. So yeah, I think that's an important part, and I agree probably a lot of crypto supporters might not agree with that, but that's my personal view.
No, definitely. And my last question to you again in the same time machine. What do you think? What do you see as a long-term impact of Greenlabs and Greencoin? You mentioned about that by the end of the century, will 3.5 degree would be
Well, if things don't
increased.
change, right?
If you what percentage if will you say that it's a success if you think if Greenlabs is able to decrease it by a certain percentage?
Well, at least in the current form, our project will not make that much of an impact.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's the effort,
Correct.
it's the intention. I think the challenge is much bigger, and that's what myself and Deshith have also approached the challenge with. We always try to collaborate with people, with entities who are in the same field,
Hmm.
because it's a massive challenge,
Okay.
right? And we are just a very small part of the solution.
Hmm.
At least our project is. But it just needs much more traction from individuals, but also governments as
Mm.
well.
Hmm.
So I hope things pick up,
Hmm.
but right now they're not looking very
Hmm.
amazing.
I mean, I completely agree with you, and all the viewers who are watching this, although we are too much inclined towards crypto, we don't think about ESG, and today's session was just because to understand that it's a real problem which the whole team is trying to solve. Anything else which you would like to tell our viewers as we end this conversation, Hassan and Deshith, both of you?
Yeah, I guess just glad to have the opportunity to actually talk about sort of sustainable finance in the blockchain world and the sort of concept that we're trying to bring forth. I guess even if you look at like numbers of the markets in the carbon industry now, for example, the mandatory markets at like 900 billion market cap, and so if you want to be a voluntary actor, the voluntary carbon market was valued at like 2.5 billion in 2021 by McKinsey, and it's only growing exponentially. And I think everyone will be jumping on the bandwagon of trying to be eco-conscious, whilst like Hassan mentioned, having a financial incentive to do so as well, considering that's what everyone should be striving for. And I think it's been great talking to you regarding our project, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think from my side, just on the closing end, I think my understanding of blockchain, which of course is the least of everybody in this room and also on the webcast, is that blockchain is meant to solve a problem, right? And the value comes in for anything when you solve a problem, right? And the climate challenge that we are facing as individuals, as countries, as globally, I think that's a big problem. So this is where I personally think blockchain can be of value. And I think that's what I would just like the viewers to take away, that this is part of, this provides a angle of participating in trying to solve the problem. And be it our project, be it some other project, I would still encourage that for them to look into it, consider it, and if they're considering going into crypto, look at what it's solving basically. So that would be my closing remarks.
Great. Thank you, Deshith and Hassan, for coming on the podcast on Voice of Crypto and sharing your vision with us. And I think all the viewers will also agree with this, that it's a real problem and we need to try and solve it. And thank you everyone for listening to this podcast and watching this video. And I'll be back with a new interesting guests and new interesting project next week. Till that time, keep watching Voice of Crypto and do follow us on YouTube and podcast. Thank you very much.